Well, good evening and welcome to Tucker Carlson Tonight. We're beginning tonight with a story we just learned a few hours ago, a story that amazed us. Last night in this show, we told you about how the Podesta Group, a lobbying firm co-founded by Hillary Clinton's campaign chairman John Podesta and his brother Tony, have been sucked into independent counsel Robert Mueller's investigation of alleged Russian interference in American politics. Before last night's show was even over, we got an email from a man with direct personal knowledge of that story. The man, whose name we can't reveal for the time being, is a former senior employee of the Podesta Group. He worked there for years. He said he was motivated to contact us by the disgust he felt watching media coverage of the Russia story. Not only were most reporters getting it wrong, he said, they were getting it backward. The Russians were, in fact, deeply involved in American politics, but the real story had almost nothing to do with the 2016 presidential campaign. Well, intrigued, we agreed to meet with that source today. He just left our offices here in Washington a couple of hours ago. The story he told us is astonishing. We'll be following up on it, confirming more of it, and bringing you details throughout this week and after. But first, here's an overview of what he told us. Media reports describe Paul Manafort as a central figure in the Russia investigation due to the several months he spent as Donald Trump's campaign chairman. According to our source, that's only half true. Manafort is indeed at the center of this investigation, but not because of his ties to Trump. In fact, Paul Manafort spent years working with the Podesta Group on behalf of Russian government interests. That relationship extends back to at least 2011, when our source claims Manafort had dinner in Washington with both Podestas, Tony and John. In the years following, our source says he saw Paul Manafort in the Podesta Group offices, quote, all the time, at least once a month. Manafort was not there to socialize. He was representing Russian business and political interests who sought to influence Capitol Hill, Hillary Clinton's State Department, and the Obama administration. Our source describes Manafort bringing what he called a parade of Russian oligarchs up to the Congress, where they met with members and their staffs. But the central effort to extend Russian influence was focused on the executive branch, the Obama administration. The vehicle through which Paul Manafort worked for the Russians was a shell group called the European Center for a Modern Ukraine. Now, the group supposedly was based in Belgium, but it had no actual offices there. It had, in fact, only 2 employees, both of them based in Ukraine. Their telephone number in Brussels rang in Kiev. It was a sham. Yet it did have a presence here in Washington. The European Center for a Modern Ukraine was a major client of the Podesta Group. Now, why did the Russians choose the Podesta Group? Well, because both Podestas were close to the Clintons, and Hillary was then Secretary of State. She could get things done for the Podesta's Russian clients. It was influence peddling, the most obvious kind. For example, our source says that at John Podesta's recommendation, his brother Tony hired a man named David Adams. Now, before joining the Podesta Group, Adams worked at the State Department as Assistant Secretary of State for Legislative Affairs. He was also Chief Legislative Advisor to Hillary Clinton. As part of his job, Adams personally briefed Hillary Clinton every day. He aided in the confirmation of at least 122 political nominees at State. By hiring him in 2013, our source says, the Podesta Group got a direct liaison between their offices, and by extension their Russian clients, and Hillary's State Department. Sometimes, our source said, ties between the Podesta Group and the Clintons were explicit. Tony Podesta spoke regularly to Hillary Clinton while she ran the State Department. Our source remembers Podesta's assistant announcing that, quote, Secretary Clinton is on the line. At one point in either 2013 or maybe early 2014, our source says a meeting was held that included both Tony Podesta and a representative of the Clinton Foundation. The explicit subject of that meeting? How to assist Uranium One. That's the Russian-owned company that controls 20% of American uranium production, and whose board members gave more than $100 million to the Clinton Foundation. As our source put it, quote, Tony Podesta was basically part of the Clinton Foundation. Now, apparently there was not a lot of pretending about this internally at the Podesta Group. According to our source, Manafort was clear, crystal clear, that Russia wanted to cultivate ties to Hillary Clinton in the belief she was likely to become president. These links to Hillary were apparently quite valuable to the Russian. Our source believes that the Russian money Manafort funneled to the Podesta Group greatly exceeds the roughly $1 million they were officially paid. That's what he said. Some of these payments, he indicated, could be hidden kickbacks that would be hard for investigators to trace. Our source described the Podesta Group's books as, quote, a treasure trove and highly secret. He told us the Podesta Group had no board overseeing it and that all financial decisions internally were made by Tony Podesta personally. The group's employees, he said, included a person whose only official job was managing Tony Podesta's art collection. It would be obviously pretty easy for an organization like that to conceal financial transactions. Now, the source we spoke to has been interviewed extensively by Robert Mueller's independent investigators. In press accounts, Mueller's investigation is still framed as a hunt for collusion between Donald Trump's presidential campaign and the government of Russia. Our source says investigators are, in fact, very interested in Manafort's behavior while he ran the Trump campaign, but otherwise that description is mostly bogus. The investigation has broadened now to determine which people and which organizations in Washington have spent years working secretly as de facto operatives on behalf of Russian government and business interests. The Podesta Group is chief among these. Quote, they are more focused on facilitators of Russian influence in this country, says our source, than they are on election collusion. The Podesta Group, he says, quote, is in their crosshairs. Now, we should note the obvious, which is that many of the lobbying efforts our source described to us today are not yet illegal necessarily, and that tells you a lot about modern American politics. But if true, the story we heard overturns much of what we think we know about Russian attempts to influence American policy. We believe our source is telling the truth. We don't think he has reason to lie to us. The facts we've been able to check have turned out to be accurate. We believe our source has exposed behavior that undermines this country, but that unfortunately is common here in Washington. We plan to proceed carefully as we report this out, but we will proceed, bringing you everything we find. We suspect there's a lot there. Britt Hume is Fox's senior political analyst, and he joins us tonight. Britt, the fact, or the idea from our source, that Paul Manafort was working for the Podesta Group on behalf of Russian interests before running the Trump campaign changes this story completely, it seems to me.
It does change it completely, Tucker. It suggests that what collusion there may have been was between Paul Manafort and the Podesta Group on behalf of Russian interests. And the Podesta Group is these two guys, Tony and John. They lie at the heart of the Democratic Party and certainly of the Clintons and their political endeavors. So this changes the whole character and focus. And it does raise also the question, Tucker. I mean, you're coming around to getting at this now, and that's remarkable on your part to have gotten this source to come and talk to you. How could it be that all these journalists working for other news organizations have been chasing this story these many months and never ran across any of this? Remarkable indeed.
Well, that is exactly the point.
But this does change things.
Well, I mean, how could actually, I mean, you've been in journalism longer than I've been alive. How could the central front group that Manafort was representing the money goes through the Podesta Group and nobody notices? I mean, the Podesta Group has 75 employees in Washington. Nobody has mentioned that to a journalist in the past 11 months. I find that not believable.
Well, I find it's pretty striking, and it suggests that the work that's been done on this story has not been of the best quality, or this would have turned up. And I'd also suggest that you have a pack of journalists who were so determined to follow one storyline that they completely missed this. So this is a big deal on a lot of levels, and it is particularly noteworthy, Tucker, that we hear that Robert Mueller is on this, and that suggests that his investigation, which might have been initially about Russian efforts to influence the election, is now a much more broad-gauged effort to determine the extent and depth of Russian efforts to influence American policy going back several years. And if that's the case, and if all that we hear about the Podestas is true, it seems to me that the Democrats who've been complaining about this and making all kinds of allegations about this all this time are going to be very disappointed in its outcome.
Well, yeah. I mean, considering that for the last year we've heard that America faces no greater foe, has never faced a greater foe than Putin's Russia, and they're seeking to undermine our democracy, destroy our country. And now it turns out that two of the people closest to Hillary Clinton were working for them. I mean, I don't really know how Democrats will respond to that.
Well, it's also the case, too, of course, if we look at this Uranium One matter that is coming more and more to light. It appears that we have the Obama administration, in its effort to seek a closer relationship with Russia, acquiescing in a sale of materials that are strategic and that could certainly be argued place American security interests at some risk. And, you know, all of this going on, of course, while, and this has been known, this, unlike this, what you've just reported, has been known for some time, but it seems to be becoming into sharper focus at the moment and will be the subject of congressional investigations going forward. So Democrats can scream a lot, and they no doubt will, that all that's a diversion. But I'm beginning to think that those claims and accusations are going to ring a little hollow in light of what you're reporting and what else is coming out even as we speak tonight.
We can't get a Democrat on the show tonight. We couldn't get a member of Congress. We, of course, reached out immediately to the Podesta Group for comment on what we found. We didn't hear back from them. As if there isn't enough news today, there's late-breaking news that apparently the information that comprised the now famous dossier that BuzzFeed printed, that information was paid for by the DNC and the Hillary Clinton presidential campaign.
Right.
I'm not even sure how to respond to this.
You know, well, it's striking because, you know, that dossier, even as it appeared at the time, was pretty widely recognized, even among media unsympathetic to Donald Trump, as scurrilous, and a lot of it was demonstrably false. So this was a pretty shabby piece of business here. And if it turns out that, as we now believe, that it was paid for in considerable measure by the Clinton campaign and the Democratic Party, and of course this contained within it, Tucker, were allegations about Trump collusion with the Russians. So that tends to soil that whole allegation even further. So the tide may be now turning in all this in political terms, and one might also hope in journalistic terms.
Kind of brazen, though. I mean, if one of your chief fundraisers and the guy who's running your campaign is in effect working with Paul Manafort, it's a little brazen for you to run around claiming that Paul Manafort, when he worked for Donald Trump, was colluding with the Russians. No? I mean, what does it take to claim something like that?
Well, yeah, brazen might be the right word. You know, one hardly knows what to say about that, but it certainly reveals another side of this story that may be bigger and more important than these allegations, which have so far remained virtually without evidence. The allegations of collusion between the Trump campaign itself and the president, the man who's now president, and the Russians is virtually non-existent after all these months.
Yes.
And now we hear about all this other stuff. So once, as I suggest, Tucker, the tide may now be turning in all this, and not in a way that Democrats are going to enjoy.
No, I'd be concerned if I were the Podestas, very concerned. Britt, thank you very much for that. Appreciate it.
You bet, Tucker.
Up next, we'll get further reaction to the allegations we just brought you from a former member of President Obama's campaign team. That's next.
Okay, anytime, Tucker.
So we now have a source saying, who we spoke to a couple hours ago, saying that a representative from the Clinton Foundation had a meeting at the Podesta Group, founded, as you know, by John and Tony Podesta here in Washington, a sort of locus of Democratic politics in this city, in which the Clinton Foundation person said, we need to do all we can to help Uranium One. And that's the group whose board members gave over $100 million to the Clinton family foundations. That's not fake news, that's real. What's the innocent explanation for that?
That we were seeking to reset our relationship with Russia and get the Kremlin on board with the Iran nuclear deal. And I do want to say, hey, you said earlier that you couldn't get a Democrat on the show, but here I am.
A member of Congress, but you're nice to come. Look, I mean, that's a real explanation, and actually I think that's probably the real explanation. They were very focused on the Iran nuclear deal, and they wanted Russia on board. But in exchange, we gave up control of 20% of our strategic uranium reserves. And I don't think anybody, in retrospect, thinks that's a wise idea. Do you?
You know, honestly, Tucker, I see this as a win because for so long this was just thrown off as a myth. It was dismissed. The president told us this was fake news. But I'm glad to see that Republicans are now beginning to take this seriously, that Russia is seeking to destabilize our democracy. I don't see this as a partisan issue. This is just they're whatever it takes to destabilize our democracy.
It turns out to be a Democratic issue because Paul Manafort was working on behalf of Russian interests with the Podesta Group. Paul Manafort, the former chairman of Trump's campaign, was working with the Podesta Group, founded by the chairman of Hillary's campaign, to influence the Obama administration and Hillary Clinton's State Department. That kind of changes the storyline a little bit, wouldn't you say?
I think that Robert Mueller is going to leave no stone unturned. And
I'm sorry, Mueller.
glad.
I mean, what do you say about that?
Americans are glad. They want to know exactly what's going on. They don't care about the partisan politics. They want to know what Russia is trying to do here to destabilize our democracy.
Okay,
and I want to say,
but hold on. But I agree. Hold on. Let me agree with you and say, however, that what we've just discovered contravenes everything that Democrats have been saying for the last 11 months. It turns out the only information that I've verified is that the Russians were attempting to influence the Obama administration and the Hillary Clinton State Department, and they got pretty far in that effort with the help of Paul Manafort. That's not shocking to you?
Nothing shocks me when it comes to Russia, Tucker. And I want to say that one thing with this recent story about the Podesta group is that we have got to make some gains here, or some improvements to the Foreign Agents Registration Act, because it's very lax. We saw that with General Flynn, and I really think would not be surprised if there's a problem here. And I'm glad that Mueller is going to be, it's not just a partisan investigation. He's leaving no stone unturned. I'm confident that Hillary Clinton will be clean.
We'll find.
I think that her name's going to be cleared.
Why would you be confident of that? Hold on. When we just discovered that one of her aides at the State Department was hired by Tony Podesta, one of her biggest fundraisers, to lobby her on behalf of Russia, apparently, that's what our source told us, how does that exculpate her? That seems to incriminate her to me.
I think that's a stretch, and $145. That's been $145. I know that was debunked. I saw in PolitiFact that when you boiled it down, it was more like $4 million. And I want to say that one thing that's being left out of this narrative. Well, one thing that's being left out of this narrative is that Russia can't export this uranium outside of the United States. It's not like they can do just whatever they want with it. They're not licensed to. It's going to stay here. But what we need
that actually hasn't. I went through this last night with someone who doesn't read the New York Times. I don't know why I'm the only one reading the New York Times as someone who despises the paper, but they've already reported that a great deal of that uranium has been exported without an export license against U.S. law, but it has left our country to places unknown. So, places we can't be certain of where it went. So, we know that, and so there's no defending that. But let me just ask really quickly, why are you so certain that Hillary will be exonerated when it seems very clear to me that the Russians were directly influencing her behavior as Secretary of State?
Because, Tucker, this wasn't just her decision. This was approved by the CFIUS. There were 9 agencies that approved this deal. The State Department, the Attorney General, the Secretary of the Treasury, the Defense Secretary, the Commerce. I could go on and on.
What is it about Hillary that makes people defend her at all costs? I mean, you know what I mean? Like, if you came to me and said, I don't know, Donald Trump has been, caught on camera committing cannibalism, I'd say, you know what? I'm not going to defend that. I mean, you know what I mean? Like, what is it about Hillary where she exercises such deep loyalty in people? It's strange, but anyway, good job. Thanks, Robin, for being the only one who come on tonight. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Tucker. Anytime.
Mark Cuban says he's thinking about running against Donald Trump in the next presidential election, 2020, as a Republican. What would he do differently? What does Mark Cuban believe? We'll ask him live next. Mark Cuban is a famous billionaire. He owns the Dallas Mavericks. He hosts a very popular TV show. Now he may want to be president. He recently said he's considering a run in 2020. If he does, he said he'll run as a Republican, potentially mounting a primary challenge to President Trump. What kind of president would Mark Cuban be? He's a very direct man, so we thought we'd ask him. Mark Cuban joins us tonight. Mark, thanks a lot for coming on.
Thanks for having me, Tucker.
So rather than ask you all the boring political questions, how you do it, how you raise the money, all that stuff, I just want to ask you what you believe, because I think you're really direct. So there are about 560 billionaires in the United States right now. In 2009, when Obama took office, there were 200 fewer. So there's been a massive increase in wealth at the top end. Meanwhile, the middle classes remain stagnant. Is that a problem?
No question.
And what would you do about it?
Yes, it's a problem. The first thing I would do, rather than the tax reform we're looking at right now, I decrease payroll taxes significantly, so that money, instead of having every hour taxed as it is now, that money would go right into the hands of the people who need it the most. We have 77,000 people who get paid by the hour. We're ignoring them.
Well, I mean, that would definitely put money in people's pockets. How would you pay for the entitlements they use?
The entitlements in terms of which entitlements?
Well, I mean, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, all that with less tax revenue? Like, how would you fund that stuff?
Well, obviously, that's a challenge right now, and we need to find ways to reduce the cost of those entitlements while maintaining the same level of care. I'm a tech guy, and the reality is I would focus on creating technology solutions. I have investments that I see myself where it can have an impact. I think there's a way that we can reduce the size of government, the size of bureaucracy that deals with healthcare, but it's going to take somebody who understands technology that can introduce technology to find those solutions. And I think it can happen relatively quickly.
You definitely understand technology, and you've been one of the people, I think to your great credit, who's been sounding the alarm about automation's effect on employment. You said robots are basically going to kill a lot of jobs. I think you're right. Given that, is allowing about 1 million low-wage, low-skilled workers into the country every year legally, is that a good idea? Is that the right level of immigration?
You know what? You can argue both sides of that, Tucker. I don't have all the data to make the final decision, but on one hand, you can say that it takes jobs away from people who need them the most. On the other hand, because of the demographic trends, you can say we need people to fill certain jobs. If you look at agriculture, there's jobs that are going unfilled. So, there's arguments for both sides. I'm not ready to come to a conclusion.
If you found out tomorrow that Iran had a usable nuclear weapon, would that justify a military strike by the United States?
Not immediately, no. It would just depend what else we can do. I mean, at that point, obviously, diplomacy had failed. And so I'm a tech guy, right? You can't ignite, you can't launch, you can't control a lot of these things just in the blind. At some point, you're going to have access to us. I think cyber military, if you want to call it that, an aggressive or proactive version of cybersecurity, I think that has to have a real impact, and that has to be a focus, and we're not focusing enough on it yet. I think there's a greater risk in our cybersecurity efforts than there are for bombings. I mean, if somebody can hack into our military, we're at far greater risk.
And last question, if the numbers show that a little over 40% of all kids born in America last year were born to women who were not married, born out of wedlock, does that bother you, that number?
Yeah, I mean, that number's declining, first of all, but I'll say this very clearly, Tucker. You can't legislate morality.
Right.
And when government comes in and tries to legislate how people think about just about any topic, that's when we start having more problems. And so we can try to educate, we can try to support families, we can try to support church groups, we can support schools, we can support synagogues, we can support mosques, and that's how we can teach a lot of things. But if we try to legislate what happens in those areas, it's a slippery slope.
Right, I guess, but my question is, do you think it's bad? That's it. I'm not even suggesting a solution. Does it bother you?
I think, you know what, me, in a lot of respects, yes, but I think culture changes. Things that we saw as bad 50 years ago, we don't see bad today. Again, I'm not going to be a social justice warrior and try to tell people what's right or wrong. I just think if we educate people, we try to do the right thing, we support our kids, and we focus on educating them, these things tend to work out the way they should.
Mark Cuban, thanks a lot for coming. I hope we see you again.
Yeah, and thanks for the direct questions, Tucker. I appreciate them.
Well, an immigrant woman in California was recently able to obtain American citizenship despite having, by her own description, no ability to read or write English. That shouldn't be a surprise, though. According to the Census Bureau, nearly 45% of California households speak a language other than English at home. Stephen Camarata is Director of Research for the Center for Immigration Studies. He joins us now. So I have a couple questions. Stephen, first, I thought in order to become a citizen, you had to have some mastery of English.
No. Basically, the way it works is if you've been here for 20 years and you're over 50, they can give you a waiver. In addition, the actual English language question is only like one sentence. And you can take the
But hold on, just to clarify, the intent of the law, though, I mean, when lawmakers passed this, it was they wanted people speaking English before they became citizens, correct?
Yeah, that was the idea, but it's not really enforced. There's tremendous discretion on the part of the examiner. So basically, it looks like maybe a third, a quarter of all people who have naturalized citizens are functionally illiterate in English. And that's partly because of this waiver system, but partly because even if you pass the test, it doesn't mean very much. It's basically 1-2 sentences, and if you have to be able to read it, that kind of thing.
So we're not really trying to assimilate anybody, and we're kind of lying about that. So, but what happens if you have the biggest state in the United States, California, and nearly half of the families there don't speak English at home? Language is culture. They're not part of the larger American culture, or am I overstating it?
Well, you might be, because it doesn't mean that they don't know any English. It doesn't mean that they're completely isolated, but you raise a profound point. Look, one of the ways assimilation works is immigrants and their kids basically are submerged in an ocean of natives and their kids who speak English
exactly.
and so forth. But in a place like California, and actually throughout all over the United States, we have a situation where the level of immigration has been so high for so long. We now have about 66 million people who don't speak English at home. About half of them say that they don't speak English well, even though the rest say they do. We don't know how well they actually speak, but research suggests most of them don't speak English very well, even when they say they do. So the numbers are so big, it kind of overwhelms, if you will, the assimilation process, and it creates all kinds of political pressure to do things like this, create waivers and so forth.
So the people who are born here wind up assimilating to the culture of the immigrants brought here.
Yeah, about half those people who don't speak English at home are U.S. born. They're not foreign born.
It's ominous, I think, because it's hard to have a united country with multiple languages.
Look, English is one of the glues that holds the country together, and it's not clear that the country can withstand this level of immigration.
Stephen Caramata, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Conservatives at Columbia University in New York City are being individually targeted by Antifa. An inside look at what is going on there at Columbia next. Conservative students at Columbia University apparently are being targeted by the left after college Republicans there invited Mike Cernovich to speak on campus. Flyers associated with Antifa have shown up all around campus. The flyers feature the names and photographs of college Republicans and encourage harassment of them. One of them is Aristotle Busalis. He's the head of the Columbia College Republicans. He joins us tonight. Aristotle, thanks for coming on.
Thank you,
did I misstate the facts of the case? You invited this guy, Mike Cernovich, on, and now you're on flyers around campus.
Yeah, so recently, the last few days, Antifa has placed flyers all around our campus indicating who we are and our board members. The disgusting thing is that the university hasn't put out a statement condemning these actions, and we're living targets right now on this campus. It's like the Wild West at this point.
So tell us what the flyers say. There they are. I think we just flashed one with your picture on it.
Yeah, so the flyers indicate for these people to come up and say something to us. The scary thing is we don't know what these people will do to us. If I walk outside on campus, I could get attacked by any person. The university needs to stop these people from doing these actions, because any student that is just in general questioning of ideas is a target at this campus.
Have you gone to the Columbia administration about this?
Yes, I filled out harassment complaints. They recently sent me an email, but they haven't offered any protection or public safety. I've reached out to them, but their response has been slow. And I wish they would say or condemn these actions. They will protect all students on this campus, because this is a place for academic, intellectual curiosity, and this is not what they're doing at this point.
Are the flyers still around campus?
Yes, there was a flyer today, and we found a few others today. But we're trying to take them down, and we've had people look at us when we're taking them down, intimidating us. This group, Antifa, is labeled, as you know, with the Department of Homeland Security as a domestic terrorist organization. And Columbia needs to take action against these people, because these people have committed acts at Berkeley, Buffalo, and other schools, as you see throughout these videos that you're showing right now.
Well, we've covered it extensively.
Yeah.
I mean, if you were my son, I'd be legitimately worried about your safety. How do your parents feel about this?
My parents actually want me to take off the second semester of my spring semester, but I won't do that. Our club's going to stand for what we believe in, and we're going to make sure we support freedom of speech on this campus. As you know, college is a place for people to discuss ideas, be challenged and questioned. Yeah. A lot of these different Antifa members are not willing to have these conversations. That's why they're resorting to violence. They're afraid of ideas.
College was that. Increasingly, it's a joke, especially the kind of college that you go to. And you're smart and you're brave, and I think if you dropped out tomorrow, you'd do really well, probably better than your classmates who are going to wind up robots after 4 years of that nonsense. So I recommend you drop out. I'm with your parents. But good luck. Aristotle, you're a brave man.
Okay. See you, Tucker.
Up next, Hillary Clinton says the new focus on Uranium One is just a distraction from what she wants to talk about, which is, of course, sexism. Well, all the evidence we have, is it worth talking about? We'll tell you next. President Trump was attacked by a protester at the Capitol today. He threw Russian flags at the president and then shrieked about treason. Well, at this hour, we don't know very much about the protester. He certainly looks demented. Maybe he is. On the other hand, maybe he's not. Maybe he just believed everything he sees on cable news. When the entire ruling class spends the better part of a year pushing ludicrous conspiracy theories about treason and Russian interference in the election, you've got to expect that some people are going to take them seriously. Maybe he's been watching Hillary Clinton, in fact.
Russians ran an extensive information war campaign against my campaign to influence voters in the election. The Russians, in my opinion, and based on the intel and counter-intel people I've talked to, could not have known how best to weaponize that information unless they had been guided.
Amazingly, the Russians had just been lobbying her. It takes a lot of chutzpah to say that. She knows Vladimir Putin didn't steal the election from her. She says it anyway because it's easier than apologizing for her own many mistakes. But there is a cost to telling lies like that. You just saw it on the video we played. Well, Democrats have been hyping up the Russian collusion story, of course, but they're also downplaying everything having to do with the Uranium One story. It's been carried on no other networks with one minor exception. There is evidence it's not fake news. It is a real story. Rory Murdoch has been covering it carefully. He's a contributing editor at National Review Online, and he joins us tonight. DeRoy, I don't think I'm making that up. This story has basically not appeared on other channels, again, with I think just one exception. I haven't seen it on the front page of the New York Times or the Washington Post. How can that story be ignored?
You're right. It's amazing. According to the Media Research Center, I think between over the last 10, 11 months, the networks have spent something like 3 minutes and 1 second on this story. And what's amazing about it, whether you think it's got legs or not, you've got bribery, you've got kickbacks, you've got extortion, you've got Russians, you've got uranium, the main ingredient for atomic bombs. I mean, this is interesting stuff. This is the things of which spy novels are made. And yet the networks ignore this and still talking about Russia, 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 and what collusion was there. And it appears as if we had collusion on the part of not the Republicans, but on the part of the Democrats, Hillary Clinton, and now the Podesta Group, all designed around bringing in $145 million, a tremendous amount of money, into the Clinton Foundation, and in exchange, the Russians now control 20% of the United States uranium supply, and apparently some of that uranium is leaving this country. It seems like something worth covering to me.
I think it is, and Russia's at the very center of it. So as you just said, board members of this company, which is controlled by the Russians, donated $145 million to the Clinton Family Foundation.
Absolutely.
At around the same time that Hillary Clinton's State Department okayed the deal. Now, look, I'm not alleging criminality here, but I'm noting the obvious, which is what? How can that not be a legitimate line of inquiry for journalists?
And, you know, maybe after looking into it, it turns out it's really more innocent than it is. I don't think so. But, yeah, at least look into it. And I'm glad to see that the House and House Intelligence Committee and I believe the Senate Judiciary Committee are now going to look into this. They've not held a hearing on Uranium One yet. And these are the Republicans who control Congress. I find that astonishing. So I'm glad that they finally look like they're going to hold hearings on this. I believe they're trying to get the gag order lifted on this confidential witness, this businessman who actually was cooperating with the FBI in all of this. He was put under a gag order by the Obama administration, so he actually wouldn't talk to Congress. Imagine that. So they're trying to get that gag order lifted. It should be lifted since, of course, Eric Holder and Loretta Lynch are no longer running the Department of Justice. That's now the job of Jeff Sessions, the Donald Trump administration. So that gag order should be lifted right now, and that person ought to be able to come forward and tell us what he knows.
Really quickly, is there any legitimate reason for keeping someone like that under a gag order? And is that constitutional in the first place? How can the executive branch say to the Congress, we don't want this guy to talk, therefore he can't talk? Is that allowed in a democracy?
No, the Congress is a totally separate and equal branch. They have every right to bring him in and learn from him what they can so they can do their jobs. I don't think they knew about this guy. The thing is that it's not like they wanted to get him and then they gagged him. I think they had him so under wraps that they didn't even know this guy existed until probably last week, which is extraordinary. All this was going on, and the congressional oversight that should have taken place while Russia gained control of 20% of the United States supply of uranium, and the Obama administration kept the Congress in the dark on this, which I think is extraordinary. What were they hiding?
I mean, it's not like 20% of our national supply of string cheese. It's uranium.
No, yes.
It's inherently...
or cashews or bacon. No, this is the stuff that people use.
You're getting closer to
I guess
home.
Bacon, we would be concerned about that. This is the stuff people use to create nuclear weapons. This is serious stuff, and now some of it appears to be leaving this country. This is deadly, deadly stuff. This is potentially life and death, and I really wish that the media media would be awake about this rather than continue to snore on channels other than this one.
Well, Congress certainly is, and we're going to get to that right now. Droy, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Tucker.
Well, as you just heard, 2 House committees have launched a joint inquiry into the Uranium One deal following revelations that the Justice Department discovered a massive Russian bribery ring supporting the deal, but did not tell Congress about it. Congressman Ron DeSantis represents the state of Florida. He serves on the House Oversight Committee, one of the 2 involved in that investigation. He joins us tonight. Congressman, thank you.
Thanks for having me.
So, first things first, how could Congress not have known about this?
Well, just first with the string cheese, I think if Donald Trump sold string cheese to the Russians, the Democrats would be upset about that.
That's probably right.
So it's really mind-boggling. I mean, we have this informant that we want to bring in. I think we will get him in either through subpoena or by them lifting the gag order. He started working as a confidential informant in 2009. He was in the middle of this Russian racketeering ring. 2009, 2010. And then the Uranium One deal is approved at the end of 2010. So the FBI knew that underneath this Uranium One deal, forget about all the money to the Clintons, which is serious, underneath that is all this criminality. Nobody informed Congress of that. And there was opposition to this deal in Congress anyways, just based on the merits.
Right.
But imagine something propped up by repeated criminality. I think that probably would have been enough had Congress known to put political pressure on the administration to kill the deal.
How can the former administration or any administration tell the Congress of the United States that it can't interview somebody?
Well, here's the thing. I think even on some of those NDAs, which are used sometimes with confidential informant, valid subpoena, you have to go and appear. They can't prevent you from doing that. So at a minimum, we can send a subpoena, and I think we will do that. But I think that the Attorney General wants this guy to talk, and I think they are working to kind of clear whatever brush they need to produce him.
So sweep away the politics in all this. Why would it ever be a good idea for any administration to give 1/5 of our strategic uranium reserves to the Russian government?
I don't think it would be. And you notice the Democrats say the worst thing that happens in the world is Russia spending $100,000 on Facebook ads.
Half of which ran after the election.
Exactly. And so for them to think that's the big deal, but then not think the uranium is a big deal, I just don't understand how you could hold that position.
Have you heard anybody defend it on the merits? I mean, I hear a lot of people say Hillary Clinton obviously had nothing to do with this because she's so great.
They don't. They say it's been debunked, don't worry, but there's not a substantive defense for it. And when you mention all the money going into the foundation and the $500,000 to Bill personally for a 20-minute speech, they say, oh, well, that's fine. It was Here's my question. They were sending hundreds of millions of dollars during the pendency of this deal. How much money have they sent since the election to the Clinton Foundation?
Great question.
Are they raking in money? No, no one's sending.
And I don't know the answer to that, but it's worth finding out. Quickly, we reported at the top of the show that Paul Manafort, who was the former chairman briefly of the Trump campaign, was before that working with the Podesta Group. One of his jobs was to lobby the Obama administration on behalf of Russia. Our source says he routinely took Russian business figures up to the Hill to meet with the members. Are you aware of that? Did you see that?
I never saw that. No, I didn't. I mean, I think it's pretty clear Manafort was involved in Eastern European politics, Russian politics. That, I think, is why all the smoke has come out about Trump. I don't think it has anything to do with Trump. I think a lot of this predates the campaign, and I think that's what the special counsel
Were you aware that Paul Manafort was working with the Podestas on behalf of Russia?
No.
Amazing. Amazing story. Congressman, thank you.
Thank you.
Kathy Griffin is at it again. This time she's targeting Hollywood super attorney and ersatz feminist Lisa Bloom. A strange turn of events. We've got it for you next. Former CNN star Kathy Griffin has picked a new fight, but with a surprising target this time. You'll remember that last summer, Griffin was fired after she posed with a severed Donald Trump head. At the time, Griffin's attorney was Lisa Bloom. If that name rings a bell, it's because Bloom has represented countless people charging sexual harassment. She also represented Harvey Weinstein and lots of other people in trouble. Now, in a recent Facebook post, Griffin says that Bloom practices, quote, fake feminism and is, quote, a fame whore. That revelation is not surprising, obviously, now that Bloom is also accused of offering bribes to people to be nice to Harvey Weinstein. Turns out Lisa Bloom is exactly what you thought she is, a moral cover for hire, a feminist Al Sharpton, a scam artist. Even Kathy Griffin knows that. That's about it for us tonight. Tomorrow we'll continue our investigation into the Russia scandal, the Podestas, Paul Manafort, amazing, and the Uranium One deal, and the connection of all of those to the Clintons and the Obama Foundation. We're uncovering a story that astonishes us. We're going to continue to investigate it, verifying each detail as we get them. 8 o'clock every night, the show that's the sworn enemy of lying, pomposity, smugness, and groupthink. Don't forget to DVR it if you haven't. And above all, stay tuned for Sean Hannity, who's taking it away from New York City.
All right, Tucker, what an amazing show we have.